The desert stretched endlessly before him, a vast expanse of golden sand and merciless sun that seemed to swallow hope itself. President Ibrahim Traore stood alone beside his unmarked jeep, the metal burning hot to the touch even in the early morning hours. Sweat traced slow, deliberate lines down his weathered face as he adjusted the simple cotton shirt that clung to his back. No presidential regalia adorned him today, just plain khaki pants, worn sandals, and the crushing weight of a decision that could either end his life or save thousands of others. In the shimmering distance, 3 black-flagged pickup trucks carved through the dunes, their engines growling like predators as they kicked up towering clouds of dust. Each vehicle carried armed men whose faces were hidden behind cloth wrappings, their assault rifles glinting in the harsh Sahel sunlight. This was enemy territory, a no-man's land where 12,000 souls had already been claimed by a war that seemed to have no end. What would you risk to stop a genocide? What price would you pay to silence the guns that had terrorized your people for over a decade? Ibrahim Traore, the youngest president in Burkina Faso's turbulent history, was about to find out. No military escort protected him. No foreign advisors whispered strategies in his ear. No elaborate security protocols surrounded this meeting. Just one man, walking voluntarily into the lion's den, carrying nothing but conviction and a desperate hope for peace. The story that was about to unfold would challenge everything the world thought it knew about conflict resolution, about courage, and about the price of true leadership. It would prove that sometimes the most radical act is not to fight, but to lay down your weapons and talk. But before we witness this extraordinary encounter, we must understand how a young military officer from the dusty streets of Dano became the man willing to stake everything on a handshake in the desert. The morning had begun like countless others in the presidential compound of Wagadugu. Ibrahim Traore sat in his Spartanly furnished private study, the same room where his predecessors had made decisions that shaped the destiny of 22 million Burkinabe people. The walls, painted a simple cream color, bore no portraits of foreign dignitaries or colonial-era decorations. Instead, they displayed maps of Burkina Faso's provinces, photographs of village children, and traditional Mosi artwork that reminded him daily of the people he served. At 41, Traore was acutely aware that his youth often worked against him in diplomatic circles. Gray-haired European ambassadors would speak to him with barely concealed condescension. American military advisors questioned his strategic thinking. Even some of his own ministers doubted whether someone so young could navigate the complex web of regional politics, international interests, and domestic pressures that defined West African leadership. But this morning, as he sipped weak tea from a chipped ceramic cup, a deliberate choice that reflected his rejection of presidential luxury, and reviewed the latest intelligence reports, age felt irrelevant. The pages before him told a story that had been repeating for 13 brutal years. Another village attacked, 23 civilians dead, a clinic burned to ash, a school reduced to rubble that would never again echo with children's laughter. The numbers were staggering. Since 2011, over 12,000 people had died in the conflict that had transformed northern Burkina Faso into a graveyard. Entire communities had been displaced. Schools that once buzzed with eager students now stood empty, their windows shattered and their desks covered in dust and bird droppings. Hospitals that had served as lifelines for rural communities became targets, their Red Cross symbols offering no protection from ideological hatred. Traore closed the folder with a heavy sigh and walked to the window overlooking the capital. Below him, Wagadugu stirred to life with the eternal optimism of African cities. Vendors set up their colorful stalls, arranging pyramids of oranges and tomatoes with artistic precision. Women balanced baskets on their heads as they walked with fluid grace toward the central market. Children in crisp school uniforms, their backpacks almost comically oversized for their small frames, chatted excitedly as they made their way to classes. Life continued, vibrant and resilient in the southern regions that remained largely untouched by the northern war. But Traore knew this normalcy was fragile, built on the suffering of people in provinces that many in the capital had forgotten. He had not forgotten. As a young military officer, he had walked those contested roads. He had seen the faces of despair, had held dying soldiers in his arms, had witnessed the way war transforms ordinary people into ghosts haunting their own land. The weight of leadership, he often reflected, was not just in making decisions, but in carrying the consequences of every choice. Every village you couldn't save, every child who died while you debated strategy, every mother who buried her son while diplomats argued about semantics in air-conditioned conference rooms. The previous evening had unfolded like any other diplomatic reception at the presidential palace. Foreign ambassadors mingled with government ministers, their conversations a careful dance of political courtesy and strategic maneuvering. French diplomats discussed security cooperation. American officials outlined counterterrorism initiatives. Chinese representatives spoke of infrastructure investments. The familiar choreography of international relations played out under crystal chandeliers that cast prismatic light across the polished marble floors. Traore moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and exchanging politenesses, while his mind remained partially focused on the intelligence briefing he would review later that night. These social gatherings were necessary theater, part of the complex performance of modern African leadership where domestic concerns had to be balanced against international expectations and foreign interests. As the evening wound down and guests began to make their polite departures, Traore found himself alone in the palace courtyard, enjoying a rare moment of solitude under the vast African sky. The stars above seemed impossibly bright, unmarred by the light pollution that plagued larger cities. In moments like these, he could almost forget the weight of his office and remember the young boy who had once dreamed of becoming a teacher. It was then that he noticed the elderly imam. The man appeared as if from nowhere, materializing from the shadows cast by the courtyard's ancient baobab tree. He was small and bent with age, his white beard carefully trimmed, his traditional robes simple but clean. What struck Traore immediately was that he had not seen this man enter the reception. Palace security was tight, especially in these dangerous times. Every guest was screened, every name checked against security databases. Without a word, the old cleric approached with slow, deliberate steps. His eyes, despite his advanced age, were sharp and alert. When he reached the president, he extended a weathered hand that held a folded piece of paper. The exchange was silent, almost ritualistic. As he pressed the note into Traore's palm, the imam leaned close and whispered 5 words that would change everything. From Muhammad El Gazawi. Before Traore could respond, before he could ask who the man was or how he had bypassed security, the elderly imam melted back into the shadows as mysteriously as he had appeared. Palace guards, when questioned later, would swear they had seen no such person. Security cameras would show nothing unusual. It was as if the encounter had been a dream, save for the very real piece of paper now burning in Traore's pocket. The name Muhammad El Gazawi sent a chill down the president's spine that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. Every intelligence officer in West Africa knew that name. Every counter-terrorism expert had studied his methods. Every government in the Sahel region had placed bounties on his head. El Gazawi was the phantom of the desert, the elusive leader of the most brutal and effective insurgent network in the region. Western intelligence agencies had been hunting him for over a decade. French military forces had launched countless operations trying to eliminate him. American drones had searched for him across thousands of square miles of harsh terrain. Yet he remained a ghost, striking without warning and disappearing without a trace. More than just a military commander, El Gazawi had become a symbol of resistance for some and terror for others. His organization was responsible for hundreds of attacks, thousands of deaths, and the displacement of entire communities. The mention of his name could clear a room of aid workers or send government officials into emergency security protocols. That such a man would reach out to the president of Burkina Faso was unthinkable. That he would propose dialogue was inconceivable. Yet the note in Traore's pocket was undeniably real. In the privacy of his study, with the door locked and his phone turned off, Traore carefully unfolded the paper. The message was written in clear, elegant French script on simple white paper. President Traore, for 13 years, our people have bled while foreign powers profit from our pain. Your soldiers cannot defeat us. We cannot overthrow you. But our children continue to die in a war that serves no one except those who sell weapons and those who exploit our resources. I propose what has never been attempted: direct dialogue between us, without intermediaries, without foreign oversight, without the performance of international diplomacy. Meet me alone. No guards, no weapons, no recording devices. The coordinates are enclosed. You have 48 hours to decide. One chance for peace. M. L. Gazawi. P.S. If you choose to come, bring nothing but your courage. If you choose not to come, the war continues as before. The choice, for once, is entirely yours. Traore read the message 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. The tone was neither threatening nor pleading. It was direct, almost businesslike, as if proposing a routine meeting between equals rather than a potentially suicidal encounter between sworn enemies. The coordinates at the bottom of the page referred to a location in the vast desert region that straddled the border between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. It was truly no man's land, a place where even the most experienced military units ventured only with heavy escort and air support. For a head of state to travel there alone would be beyond reckless. It would be madness. Traore set the paper down and walked to a large map of Burkina Faso that dominated one wall of his study. His finger traced the route from Wagadugu to the specified coordinates. 6 hours of driving through increasingly hostile territory, 6 hours through regions where government control was nominal at best and non-existent at worst. 6 hours toward a meeting that could easily be an elaborate assassination plot. He thought about what his advisors would say. Colonel Ouedraogo, his chief of staff, would be apoplectic. The man's entire worldview was built on protocols, security procedures, and the absolute necessity of protecting the president at all costs. The suggestion that Traore would travel into insurgent territory without escort would probably give the poor man a heart attack. His foreign minister would speak of diplomatic protocols and international law. His defense minister would outline the tactical impossibilities and strategic risks. His intelligence chief would produce dozens of scenarios, each one ending with the president's death or capture. And they would all be right from their perspective. What El Gazawi was proposing violated every principle of modern statecraft. It ignored every lesson about negotiating from strength. It abandoned every security protocol that had kept African leaders alive in an era of coups and assassinations. But as Traore studied the map and calculated risks, another voice whispered in his mind. It was the voice of every mother he had met who had lost a child to the war. It was the voice of every father who had watched his village burn. It was the voice of every young soldier who had died defending a cause he barely understood against an enemy he had never seen clearly. For 13 years, the conventional approach had failed. Military operations had multiplied enemies rather than eliminating them. International interventions had created new grievances while solving few old ones. Counter-terrorism strategies had terrorized innocent populations, while the actual terrorists remained free to strike at will. Perhaps, Traore thought as he folded the paper and placed it in his desk drawer, the most radical thing he could do was something that had never been tried. Treat his enemy as a human being capable of reason rather than a monster who could only be destroyed. Sleep did not come easily that night. Traore lay in his simple bedroom, staring at the ceiling, while his mind churned through possibilities and consequences. Through his window, he could hear the distant sounds of Wagadugu at night, the hum of motorcycle taxis, the laughter of young people walking home from bars, and the call to prayer from the city's many mosques. Normal life, peaceful life, the kind of life that millions of his countrymen in the north could barely remember. By dawn, his decision was made. At 6:30 a.m., he called his chief of staff and informed him that he would be taking a personal day. No official meetings, no ceremonial duties, just a quiet visit to his childhood village to clear his mind and reconnect with his roots. It was not unusual. Traore made such trips regularly, part of his determination to remain connected to ordinary Burkinabe people rather than becoming isolated in the presidential bubble.
Colonel Wagadugu accepted the explanation without question. He was accustomed to his president's occasional need for solitude and reflection. Such trips were actually encouraged by the security team, as they provided opportunities to reinforce Traore's image as a man of the people, while also allowing him to gather intelligence about conditions outside the capital. By 8 a.m., Traore had changed from his presidential attire into the clothes of an ordinary citizen: khaki pants, a cotton shirt, worn sandals, and a simple cap to shield his eyes from the sun. No insignia marked his status. No jewelry indicated his wealth. No weapon suggested his power. He looked like any middle-aged Burkinabe man heading out for a day of business in the countryside. The motor pool clerk barely looked up as Traore signed out an unmarked Toyota Land Cruiser, one of dozens of such vehicles used by government employees for routine trips. The guard at the palace gate offered a respectful nod, but asked no questions. To all appearances, the president was simply taking a well-deserved break from the pressures of office. As Wagadugu disappeared in his rearview mirror, Traore felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in months, he was alone with his thoughts, free from the constant presence of advisors and bodyguards, free from the endless stream of meetings and briefings that consumed his days. The road ahead was straight and clear, cutting through landscape that gradually shifted from urban sprawl to rural farmland, to the increasingly arid terrain of the Sahel. The first 2 hours of the journey passed through familiar territory. Traore drove through bustling market towns, where merchants displayed their wares under colorful umbrellas. He passed villages where children ran alongside his vehicle, waving and laughing with the universal joy of youth. Women walking to market with baskets balanced on their heads smiled and offered traditional greetings. Farmers working their fields paused to wave at the passing vehicle. This was the Burkina Faso that most people knew, vibrant, peaceful, full of life and hope, despite economic challenges. It was easy, in these southern regions, to forget that a war was raging just a few hundred kilometers to the north. But as Traore continued his journey, the landscape began to change. The roadside vendors became fewer and more cautious. The children still ran to wave, but their clothes were more tattered, their smiles more hesitant. The villages showed signs of economic stress: empty market stalls, abandoned buildings, young men sitting idle in whatever shade they could find. By the third hour, the change was dramatic. Here were the first visible signs of the war's impact on civilian life. Burned-out vehicles rusted by the roadside, grim reminders of ambushes and attacks. Military checkpoints appeared every few kilometers, staffed by nervous young soldiers who scrutinized every vehicle with suspicious eyes. The soldiers recognized neither the vehicle nor its occupant, exactly as Traore had planned. To them, he was just another civilian traveling north, possibly a merchant or government worker on routine business. They checked his identification, asked a few standard questions about his destination and purpose, and waved him through without incident. As he progressed deeper into contested territory, the evidence of conflict became impossible to ignore. Entire villages stood empty, their residents fled to refugee camps or absorbed into extended family networks in safer regions. Schools stood with their windows shattered and their roofs collapsed. Clinics sat abandoned, their medical equipment looted and their walls scarred by bullet holes. Most heartbreaking were the children. In the villages that remained populated, young faces peered out from doorways with eyes that had seen too much. These were children who had grown up with the sound of gunfire, who had learned to recognize the distinctive whine of military helicopters, who could distinguish between the engines of government trucks and insurgent motorcycles. Traore stopped in one such village, ostensibly to buy water and stretch his legs, but really to witness firsthand the human cost of the war he was trying to end. An elderly woman approached his vehicle, her face etched with lines of worry and grief. "Are you from the government?" she asked in Moor, the local language. "I work for the government," Traore replied carefully. She studied his face for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "Tell them in the capital that we are not terrorists. Tell them that we are not criminals. We are just trying to live, to raise our children, to harvest our fields. But the soldiers think we help the rebels, and the rebels think we help the soldiers. We are caught in the middle, and our children are the ones who suffer." Traore bought her entire stock of water bottles, paying twice the asking price, and promised to carry her message to those who needed to hear it. As he drove away, he saw her in his rearview mirror, standing in the dust, watching his vehicle disappear toward the dangerous north. The final 2 hours of the journey took Traore through landscape that seemed increasingly alien and hostile. The few remaining villages were fortified like medieval outposts, surrounded by earthen walls and protected by nervous militias. Government presence was minimal, an occasional patrol or checkpoint, but clearly insufficient to provide meaningful security for the scattered population. The road itself began to deteriorate, shifting from paved highway to graded dirt track to barely marked paths through scrubland and sand. GPS signals became intermittent, cell phone coverage disappeared entirely. This was the frontier where government authority faded into the vast emptiness of the Sahel desert. As Traore navigated increasingly challenging terrain, he began to understand why El Gazawi had chosen these coordinates for their meeting. This was truly neutral ground, too far from government bases for military support, too isolated for foreign observers, too remote for media coverage. Whatever happened here would remain between the two men and the endless sky. The heat became oppressive as the sun climbed towards its zenith. Even with all windows down and the vehicle's aging air conditioning running at maximum, the temperature inside the Land Cruiser was nearly unbearable. Traore's shirt was soaked with sweat, and he had to stop regularly to drink water and prevent dehydration. The landscape around him was hauntingly beautiful in its desolation. Rolling dunes stretched to the horizon, interrupted by occasional rocky outcroppings and scattered acacia trees that provided tiny islands of shade in the vast sea of sand. The silence was absolute, except for the rumble of his engine and the whisper of wind across the dunes. It was in this otherworldly environment that Traore began to question his decision. The rational part of his mind catalogued all the ways this could go wrong. El Gazawi could simply kill him and claim victory over the Burkina Faso government. The meeting could be a trap designed to capture him for ransom or propaganda purposes. Even if El Gazawi's intentions were genuine, other factions within the insurgency might not be bound by any agreement their leader made.
But another part of his mind, the part that had driven him to seek the presidency in the first place, whispered that this was exactly the kind of risk that true leadership demanded. Anyone could order airstrikes from the safety of a command bunker. Anyone could negotiate through intermediaries while remaining personally safe. It took something different, something rarer, to put your own life on the line for the possibility of peace. The coordinates led to a location that perfectly embodied the concept of nowhere. It was a slight depression in the desert floor, surrounded by low sand dunes and marked only by a single ancient acacia tree, whose gnarled branches provided a small circle of precious shade. No structures were visible, no signs of human habitation marked the landscape. It was as if Traore had driven to the edge of the world. He parked the Land Cruiser in the meager shade of the acacia tree and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant whisper of wind across sand. He checked his watch, 2:47 p.m. He was 13 minutes early for the 3 p.m. meeting that could change the course of his nation's history. The wait was excruciating. In the absolute silence of the desert, every sound seemed amplified. The rustle of his clothing as he shifted position sounded like thunder. His heartbeat seemed loud enough to echo across the dunes. Sweat continued to pour down his face despite his efforts to remain calm and composed. 15 minutes passed, then 30, then 45. Still nothing moved in the vast landscape around him. Traore began to wonder if he had been deceived, if this entire exercise was designed to get him away from the capital while something else unfolded in his absence. Perhaps at this very moment El Gazawi's forces were attacking government installations while the president sat helpless in the desert. Then, just as doubt was beginning to overwhelm hope, he saw them. 3 black dots appeared on the horizon, shimmering in the heat haze like mirages. As they drew closer, the dots resolved into pickup trucks, Toyota Hiluxes, the vehicle of choice for insurgent forces across Africa. Black flags fluttered from their radio antennas, and armed figures were visible in their beds. The convoy approached at speed, engines roaring and wheels spinning in the loose sand. As they drew near, he could see that each truck carried 4 or 5 fighters, their faces covered by cloth wrappings that left only their eyes visible. Their weapons, AK-47s, RPGs, heavy machine guns, were displayed prominently, a reminder of the firepower that had made El Gazawi's organization so feared. The trucks came to a halt in a perfect semicircle formation, surrounding Traore's position while leaving him a clear escape route back toward government territory. It was, he realized, a professional military deployment that spoke to the training and discipline of these fighters. Engines rumbled ominously in the still desert air as armed men jumped down from the truck beds, their movements quick and coordinated. They formed a loose perimeter around the meeting site, weapons ready but not directly threatening. Their eyes, visible above their face coverings, watched Traore with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. From the center vehicle, the passenger door opened slowly, almost ceremonially. The man who stepped out was younger than Traore had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, tall and lean, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore traditional desert robes of simple white cotton, but his movements had the precision of professional military training. This was Muhammad El Gazawi, the Phantom of the Sahel, the most wanted man in West Africa, and he was walking calmly toward the president of Burkina Faso with his hands empty and visible. The two men studied each other across the few meters of sand that separated them. El Gazawi was indeed younger than his reputation suggested, but his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen and done things that aged the soul regardless of chronological years. His beard was neatly trimmed, his posture confident but not aggressive. Despite the circumstances, there was something almost scholarly about his appearance. President Ibrahim Traore, El Gazawi said, his voice carrying clearly across the desert silence. His French was fluent and educated, with the accent of someone who had received formal education in the capital. "I must admit I did not think you would come." "I keep my appointments," Traore replied, his voice steadier than he felt. El Gazawi's eyes crinkled slightly, perhaps the beginning of a smile, though his lower half of his face remained hidden behind cloth wrapping. "No guards?" he asked, gesturing toward Traore's solitary vehicle. "No weapons," Traore countered, lifting his hand slightly to show they were empty. "Nothing but words," El Gazawi confirmed, with a slight nod. It was then that Traore noticed the tent. Somehow, during his wait, or perhaps before his arrival, a simple Tuareg-style shelter had been erected near the acacia tree. It was low and unremarkable, made of beige cloth that blended almost perfectly with the desert surroundings. He had been so focused on watching the horizon for approaching vehicles that he had missed its installation entirely. "Let us talk where the sun cannot listen," El Gazawi suggested, gesturing toward the tent, "and where curious satellites cannot watch." They walked side by side across the sand, an incongruous pair, the democratically elected president of a sovereign nation and the leader of the insurgency that had challenged that nation's authority for over a decade. Behind them, armed fighters maintained their alert positions, ready to respond to any threat, but careful not to interfere with the diplomatic moment unfolding before them. Inside the tent, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the harsh desert light was filtered to a soft golden glow. The space was simple but carefully arranged. A single carpet spread across the sand, two cushions positioned facing each other, and a small wooden tray holding glasses of water and a pot of mint tea. No flags or symbols marked the space as belonging to either side. It was deliberately neutral territory. They sat cross-legged on the cushions, the traditional posture for important discussions in Sahel culture. El Gazawi performed the ritual of hospitality, pouring water into two glasses and pushing one toward his guest. The gesture was significant. In desert culture, offering water to a visitor created a temporary bond of protection and respect. Traore accepted the glass but did not immediately drink, waiting to see if his host would drink first. It was a small precaution, but in a situation like this, even small precautions mattered. "You did not come here for tea," Traore said, breaking the silence that had settled between them.
"No," El Gazawi agreed, taking a sip from his own glass. "I came because, after 13 years of blood, neither of us is winning. Your forces cannot eliminate us. We cannot overthrow you. But our people, yes, I still consider them our people, continue to suffer." The admission was significant. Despite his position as an insurgent leader, El Gazawi still claimed loyalty to Burkina Faso and its citizens. This was not the rhetoric of a foreign-backed terrorist, but of someone who saw himself as fighting for his homeland's future. "Our people," Traore echoed thoughtfully. "You still consider yourself Burkinabe?" "I was born in Djibo," El Gazawi replied, without hesitation, naming a town in the country's troubled northern region. "I studied engineering at the University of Wagadugu.
I dreamed of building irrigation systems and power plants that would bring prosperity to our rural communities. Traore was familiar with Djibo, a regional center that had been repeatedly attacked during the conflict. The town had changed hands multiple times between government forces and various insurgent groups, leaving its civilian population traumatized and displaced. What changed? Traore asked. What turned an engineering student into the most wanted man in West Africa? El Gazawi's expression darkened, though his voice remained controlled. My younger brother, Amadou, was arrested in 2014. Government forces claimed he was connected to militant activities. He wasn't. He was a teacher, passionate about education, completely apolitical. But someone had given his name to the authorities, probably to settle a personal grudge or to claim the reward money offered for information about terrorists. The story was unfortunately familiar to Traore. In the early years of the counterterrorism campaign, when pressure from international partners demanded quick results, security forces had sometimes acted on unreliable intelligence, arresting innocent people who fit certain profiles, or who had been denounced by enemies or rivals. They held him for 6 months in a detention center in Wagadugu. No charges, no trial, no access to lawyers or family. When they finally released him, he was broken. They had beaten him systematically, professionally. His spine was damaged. He walked with a cane for the rest of his short life. Traore remained silent, understanding that this was a moment for listening rather than defending or explaining government policies. He died 2 years later, El Gazawi said quietly. The doctor said it was complications from his injuries, but I knew better. They had killed him slowly, deliberately, as a message to anyone who might challenge their authority. That's when I understood that the government I had trusted, the nation I had served through my studies and my dreams, saw people like me as enemies to be eliminated rather than citizens to be protected. The tent fell silent, except for the whisper of wind against canvas. Both men sat with their own thoughts, processing the weight of this personal revelation. Traore had read hundreds of similar stories in intelligence reports, tragic cases of individuals radicalized by government overreach and abuse. Each story was a failure of the system he now led, a wound that had festered into the insurgency he was trying to end. And now you lead the most feared insurgent group in West Africa, Traore said finally, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. El Gazawi's jaw tightened slightly. That title was given to me by the same governments and media outlets that created the conditions for this war to flourish. I never sought to become a symbol of terror. I became a symbol of resistance, because resistance was the only option left for people like my brother. Resistance, Traore repeated, thoughtfully. Is that what you call the school burnings, the attacks on aid workers, the murders of village chiefs who cooperated with development projects? The questions hung in the air like accusations, but El Gazawi did not flinch or deflect. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting Traore's directly. Some of those attacks were carried out by my forces, some were not. Some were ordered by me personally. Others were the work of local commanders who acted beyond their authority or splinter groups that claim our name but reject our discipline. It was a more honest answer than Traore had expected. Most insurgent leaders, when confronted with their organization's excesses, either denied responsibility entirely or justified every action as necessary for the greater cause. But yes, El Gazawi continued,
I ordered attacks on certain schools, certain aid projects, certain government buildings, not because I hate education or humanitarian work, but because those institutions had become instruments of control rather than service. He paused to sip his water, collecting his thoughts before continuing. The schools that were burned were teaching French curriculum designed to erase local languages and customs. The aid projects that were attacked were being used to gather intelligence on local populations and to identify potential dissidents. The government buildings that were destroyed were administrative centers that existed only to extract taxes and enforce arbitrary regulations, not to provide services. Traore listened carefully, recognizing kernels of truth in the accusations. International development projects did operate with insufficient sensitivity to local cultures. Government services in remote areas were often limited to tax collection and law enforcement. Educational systems throughout Francophone Africa did prioritize European languages and perspectives over indigenous knowledge. "And the children?" Traore asked quietly. "The ones who died in the crossfire, the ones who starved when aid convoys were attacked, the ones who grew up without schools because you burned them down, were they acceptable casualties in your resistance?" For the first time since the conversation began, El Gazawi's composure cracked slightly. His hands, which had remained steady throughout their discussion, trembled almost imperceptibly as he set down his water glass. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The children were never acceptable casualties. Every child who died because of my orders, every child who suffered because of my choices, they haunt me. They visit me in dreams. They ask me questions I cannot answer." The admission revealed a depth of humanity that intelligence reports had never captured. This was not the cold-blooded terrorist of government propaganda, but a man carrying the moral weight of his actions and their consequences.
"But they died under your military operations too," El Gazawi continued, his voice growing stronger. "They died when government forces shelled villages suspected of harboring insurgents. They died when they stepped on mines laid by your soldiers. They died when they couldn't reach medical care because your checkpoints delayed ambulances for security screenings." Both men sat in the heavy silence that followed, each carrying the burden of difficult decisions made in impossible circumstances. The desert wind whispered against the tent walls, a sound like collective mourning for all the innocents who had paid the price for their conflict. The conversation had reached a critical juncture. The past had been acknowledged, mistakes admitted, pain shared. Now came the moment that would determine whether this unprecedented meeting would lead to progress or simply stand as an interesting footnote in the history of a continuing war. "What would it take?" Traore asked slowly, his words measured and deliberate. "What would convince the Phantom of the Sahel to lay down his weapons?" El Gazawi did not answer immediately. He leaned back on his cushion, his eyes focused on the tent ceiling, as if reading some invisible text written there. The silence stretched between them, filled with weight and possibility. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear and firm, the voice of someone who had thought long and hard about this moment. "Three things," he said. "First, the complete withdrawal of all French military presence from Burkina Faso. Not just a reduction in numbers or a change in mission, but total removal. Their bases, their drones, their advisors, their intelligence operatives, all of it gone within 90 days. The demand was not unexpected, but it was still breathtaking in its implications. French military support had been a cornerstone of regional security policy for decades. Removing it would require fundamental changes in defense strategy and would likely provoke strong reactions from international partners. Second, El Gazawi continued, genuine autonomy for the northern provinces. Not the token decentralization that has been promised for decades, but real self-governance. Local control over education systems that respect our languages and traditions. Community management of natural resources. Traditional authorities empowered to resolve disputes according to customary law. Development projects designed and implemented by Northerners for Northerners. This demand struck at the heart of Burkina Faso's political structure. Since independence, the country had been governed from Wagadugu, with provincial administrators appointed by the central government and answerable to ministers in the capital. True autonomy would require constitutional changes and would likely face resistance from southern politicians who feared the precedent it might set. And third, El Gazawi said, his voice dropping slightly as he reached the most sensitive point. Comprehensive amnesty for my fighters and their integration into a national reconciliation process. We cannot disarm and then be hunted. We cannot surrender only to be tried in courts that have already judged us guilty. My men must have a path back to civilian life that includes dignity, opportunity, and protection from revenge. The three demands hung in the desert air like a challenge thrown down between them. Each one represented a fundamental shift in how Burkina Faso operated as a state. Together, they amounted to a revolution in governance, a complete reimagining of the relationship between the center and the periphery, between the government and its most marginalized citizens. Traore remained silent for several minutes, his mind racing through the implications and obstacles. Agreeing to these demands would unleash fierce opposition from military hardliners who had fought the insurgency for over a decade. Political parties in the South would cry betrayal and abandonment of national unity. International partners would question his judgment and possibly withdraw support. The economic and diplomatic costs could be enormous. But rejecting them outright would mean returning to the status quo. Endless cycles of violence, continued suffering for northern populations, and the gradual erosion of state authority in vast stretches of national territory. I came here without soldiers, without armor, without the protection of my office, because I am tired of watching our people die while politicians argue and diplomats debate. But I also know that I cannot give you everything you ask for, not immediately, and not without building consensus among all our people. El Gazawi's expression remained neutral, but there was tension in his posture as he waited for the president's counterproposal. "So you came to say no?" he asked. "No," Traore replied firmly. "I came to say, let's start with something real. Something we can build on, something that proves to both our peoples and our enemies that another way is possible." He leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity of conviction. "One province, 30 days. You choose which one. We both withdraw our forces. No offensives, no raids, no propaganda operations. You keep your men positioned but inactive. We remove our heavy military presence and replace it with joint community patrols, your people and mine working together to maintain security." The proposal was bold in its simplicity. Instead of comprehensive peace negotiations that could drag on for years while people continued to die, Traore was suggesting an immediate practical test of whether cooperation was possible. "We bring in engineers, medical teams, education specialists. We start rebuilding infrastructure, reopening schools, providing services that people need. No foreign flags, no colonial bureaucrats, just Burkina Faso people working together to heal one small piece of our broken country. El Gazawi studied him intently, his sharp eyes searching for signs of deception or hidden agendas. The proposal was simultaneously more modest and more radical than traditional peace processes. More modest because it affected only one province and lasted only 1 month. More radical because it required both sides to take immediate, visible risks without the usual frameworks of international guarantees and monitored ceasefires. Which province? El Gazawi asked quietly. It was a critical question. The choice would signal how serious both men were about the experiment and how much risk they were willing to accept. You choose, Traore said. This has to be something you believe in, something your people will support. Choose the place where we think we have the best chance of proving that cooperation works better than conflict.
Another long silence filled the tent as El Gazawi considered the options. Each province under insurgent influence had different characteristics, different levels of government presence, different relationships with both sides of the conflict. "Soum," he said finally. Traore felt his heart skip a beat. Soum province was one of the most contested regions in the entire country, a known stronghold of insurgent activity where government forces operated only in heavily fortified compounds. It was also El Gazawi's home region, the place where his brother had been born and died. "Your homeland," Traore observed. "My responsibility," El Gazawi corrected. "If we can bring peace to Soum, we can bring peace anywhere. If we fail there, then we'll know that some wounds are too deep to heal." The symbolism was profound. By choosing his home province, El Gazawi was putting his personal credibility and local reputation on the line. Success would vindicate his leadership and his vision for a different kind of resistance. Failure would discredit him among his own supporters and potentially fragment his organization. 30 days, Traore repeated, extending his hand across the carpet between them. 30 days, El Gazawi agreed, taking the offered hand in a firm grip. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but it carried the weight of history. Two men who should have been enemies, who had spent years trying to destroy each other's causes, were now partners in an experiment that could reshape their nation's future. Before they concluded their meeting, Traore made one final request that surprised his host. "I want to speak with some of your fighters," he said. "Not commanders or spokesmen, just ordinary men who carry weapons in your name. I need to understand who they are and why they fight." El Gazawi considered the request carefully. Allowing a government leader to interact directly with his fighters was a security risk and could potentially compromise operational security. But it was also an opportunity to humanize his cause and demonstrate that his organization was more than the terrorist caricature presented in government propaganda. 3 men, he agreed. You may ask them whatever you wish, but they are free to answer or not as they choose. Within minutes, 3 fighters had been escorted to a separate section of the tent. Their weapons remained outside, and their faces were uncovered, a significant gesture of trust in the volatile security environment of the Sahel. The first man was older than Traore had expected, perhaps in his 50s, with sun-darkened skin and the calloused hands of someone who had spent his life working the land. He sat quietly at first, clearly uncomfortable with the unprecedented situation of speaking directly to the president of his country. "Tell me your story," Traore said gently, speaking in Moray rather than French to put the man at ease. "I was never a fighter," he began slowly, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated grief. "I was a farmer in a village near Djibo. I grew millet and sorghum, raised goats, lived peacefully with my neighbors. I had no interest in politics or war." He paused,
gathering his thoughts and his courage. My village was caught between the military and the insurgents. The soldiers said we were harboring terrorists because we gave food to anyone who asked. It is our tradition, our obligation as Muslims, to feed hungry people. The insurgents said we were collaborating with the government because we reported suspicious activities to the authorities. It is our duty as citizens to maintain security in our community. Traore listened without interruption, recognizing the impossible position that many rural communities found themselves in during the conflict. One morning, government forces came to conduct a search operation. They were looking for weapons and insurgent fighters. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find, but they were angry and frustrated. They accused us of hiding evidence, of lying to protect terrorists. The man's voice grew quieter, more pained. They set fire to several houses, including mine. My wife was inside, trying to save our possessions. She couldn't escape in time. She died in the flames while I was being held at gunpoint in the village square, forced to watch everything I had built turn to ash. Traore felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had read reports of such incidents, but hearing it firsthand from someone who had lived through the tragedy gave it a weight that no official document could convey. After that, I had nothing left to lose. My home was gone, my wife was dead, my fields were burned. The government that was supposed to protect me had destroyed my life. When the insurgents offered me a place in their organization, I accepted, not because I believed in their ideology, but because I had nowhere else to go. The second fighter was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with the bearing of an educated man. When he spoke, it was with the careful diction of someone who had spent time in classrooms. I was a teacher, he said. I taught mathematics and science in a secondary school near Arbinda. I loved my work, loved helping young people discover the beauty of knowledge and the power of education to transform lives. His story, too, was one of gradual disillusionment rather than sudden radicalization. The war made teaching impossible. Schools became targets because insurgents saw them as symbols of government authority and foreign influence. But they also became dangerous for teachers because government forces suspected that anyone with education might be secretly supporting the rebellion. He explained how the constant threat of violence had gradually emptied the schools as families sent their children away to safer regions or simply kept them home to avoid the risks of education. Eventually, he had been forced to choose between abandoning his calling entirely or joining one of the armed factions that controlled territory where schools might operate again. I chose the insurgents because they promised to create an education system that would serve our communities rather than foreign interests. I'm still waiting to see if that promise will be kept. The third fighter was the youngest, barely out of his teens, with eyes that held a disturbing combination of innocence and hardness. His story was the most tragic of all because it was the story of a childhood lost to war. "I don't remember peace," he said simply. "I was 7 years old when the fighting started in my region. I've lived my entire conscious life in a war zone." He spoke matter-of-factly about experiences that should have been unimaginable for someone his age. He had seen family members killed, had been recruited as a child soldier, had learned to handle weapons before he learned to read properly. "My father died fighting for the government when I was 10. My older brother died fighting for the insurgents when I was 14. I joined the insurgents when I was 15 because it was the only family I had left." The young man's story was a devastating indictment of how the conflict had consumed an entire generation, turning children into weapons and robbing them of the chance to develop normally. "I know how to shoot, how to hide, how to survive in the bush, but I don't know how to live in peace. I don't know what I would do with myself if the war ended tomorrow." Each story etched itself into Traore's memory with painful clarity. These were not the fanatical terrorists of government propaganda or the noble freedom fighters of insurgent mythology. They were broken men who had been swept into a conflict they had not chosen, fighting not for ideology, but for survival, for dignity, for the simple right to exist. When the interviews concluded, Traore shook hands with each man, looking them in the eyes and acknowledging their humanity even as he recognized the threat they represented to his government's authority. "Thank you for your honesty," he told them. "Your stories will not be forgotten." The journey back to Wagadugu took place in gathering darkness, the desert landscape transformed by shadows and the fading light of the setting sun. Traore drove in contemplative silence, his mind processing everything he had experienced during the most extraordinary day of his presidency. The three faces of the fighters he had interviewed replayed in his memory, each story a reminder of how the conflict had shattered lives and communities across northern Burkina Faso. These were not monsters or fanatics, but ordinary people who had been pushed beyond their breaking point by circumstances they could not control. At the same time, he understood that their stories did not excuse the violence they had committed or the suffering they had caused. The farmer whose wife had died in a government raid probably participated in attacks that killed other innocent people. The teacher who had sought to preserve education likely helped plan operations that destroyed schools in other communities. The young man who had known only war had undoubtedly inflicted trauma on other children. War, Traore reflected, was a machine that consumed everyone it touched, turning victims into perpetrators and perpetrators into victims in an endless cycle of retribution and revenge. As he approached the outskirts of the capital, the contrast between the peaceful southern regions and the war-torn north became stark once again. Here were functioning schools, busy markets, children playing safely in the streets. Here was the Burkina Faso that existed in diplomatic reports and development statistics, a poor but stable country making gradual progress toward prosperity and democracy. But he now knew intimately that this peaceful facade depended on the continued suffering of people in regions that the capital preferred to forget. The stability of the South was built on the abandonment of the North, and that foundation was ultimately unsustainable. His arrival at the presidential compound created an immediate stir. Colonel Wagadugu was waiting at the main gate, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of stress and anxiety. "Mr. President," the colonel said as Traore stepped out of the dusty Land Cruiser, "we were concerned when you didn't check in at the scheduled times. Communications were down and we had no way to reach you." "I was out of coverage area," Traore replied truthfully. "But I'm back now and I need to convene an emergency meeting of the Security Council." Within an hour, the main conference room of the presidential palace was filled with Burkina Faso's top military and civilian leadership. Defense Minister Wagadugu sat at attention, his uniform pressed despite the late hour. Foreign Minister Kabore looked puzzled by the urgency of the summons. Intelligence Chief Compaore had arrived with a thick folder of reports, clearly expecting to brief the president on some crisis that had developed during his absence. Traore entered the room calmly, carrying only a simple folder and wearing the same casual clothes he had worn to the desert meeting. The contrast with the formal attire of his subordinates was striking and intentional, a visual reminder that he had spent the day outside the protocols and pretensions of official power. "Gentlemen," he began without a preamble, "I have just returned from a meeting with Muhammad El Gazawi." The room erupted in shocked exclamations and concerned questions. Several officials spoke at once, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief and alarm.
"You met with a terrorist?" General Ouedraogo demanded. "This is unprecedented," Minister Kabore protested. "The diplomatic implications." "Sir, your security," Colonel Ouedraogo began. Traore raised his hand for silence, and the room gradually quieted, though tension remained thick in the air. "I met with him alone, without escort, without weapons, in neutral territory. We discussed terms for ending this war that has consumed our country for 13 years. He opened his folder and placed a simple map on the conference table, marking Soum province with a red circle. "We have agreed to a 30-day ceasefire in Soum province. No military operations by either side, joint community patrols, immediate humanitarian assistance and infrastructure repair. If it works, we expand it. If it fails, we return to the status quo." The silence that followed was even more profound than the earlier outburst. His advisors stared at the map as if it were a dangerous explosive device that might detonate at any moment. Defense Minister Sawadago was the first to find his voice. "Mr. President, with all due respect, this undermines everything we have worked for. We cannot negotiate with terrorists. It legitimizes their cause and encourages other insurgent groups." "The war has failed," Traore replied bluntly. 13 years, 12,000 dead, entire regions under insurgent control, and we are no closer to victory than when we started. Military solutions have created more problems than they have solved.
Foreign Minister Kabore leaned forward, his expression grave. "Our international partners will not understand this decision. France has invested heavily in counterterrorism operations. The United States has provided training and equipment. The African Union has endorsed our security policies. This reversal will damage our credibility and could result in the withdrawal of support." "Then perhaps we need to find solutions that don't depend on foreign military intervention," Traore responded. "Perhaps we need to solve Burkinabe problems with Burkinabe solutions." Intelligence Chief Compaoré, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke up. "Sir, my sources indicate that El Gazawi's organization is under internal pressure from more radical factions. He may not be able to control all his fighters or guarantee compliance with any agreement." It was a valid concern, and one that Traore had considered during his drive back to the capital. "That's why we start small. One province, 1 month. We test whether he has the authority and the will to make peace. If his fighters violate the ceasefire, we know the experiment has failed. If they honor it, we know we have a partner worth working with." The room fell into contemplative silence as his advisors absorbed the implications of his decision. Each man was calculating the risks and opportunities, weighing their own careers and responsibilities against the potential for either breakthrough or disaster. Colonel Ouedraogo, as Chief of Staff, had the responsibility to ensure that presidential decisions could be implemented effectively. "Sir," he said carefully, "if we proceed with this plan, we will need to prepare carefully. Joint patrols will require coordination protocols. Humanitarian operations will need security guarantees. Media coverage will have to be managed to prevent inflammatory reporting." It was not an endorsement, but it was not outright opposition either. The colonel was doing his job, preparing to execute a policy he might personally doubt, but professionally acknowledge as his president's prerogative. "Prepare the necessary orders," Traore instructed. "We implement the ceasefire in 72 hours. And, gentlemen," he added as the meeting began to conclude, "this information does not leave this room until we are ready for public announcement. The success of this initiative depends on controlling the narrative and managing expectations." As his advisors filed out of the conference room, each carrying the burden of a decision that could transform their nation or destroy their government, Traore remained behind to study the map of Soum province. Soon, that remote region would become the testing ground for an unprecedented experiment in African conflict resolution. The first week of the Soum ceasefire passed in an almost supernatural quiet that made everyone nervous. Military commanders reported no insurgent attacks, no ambushes of government convoys, no raids on isolated outposts. El Gazawi's fighters remained visible in their usual positions, but made no aggressive moves. It was as if both sides were holding their breath, waiting for someone to break first. In the small towns and villages scattered across Soum province, this unnatural peace was initially met with suspicion rather than celebration. People who had lived through 13 years of conflict understood that quiet periods often preceded major offensives. Many families prepared to flee at the first sign that the ceasefire was collapsing. But as days passed without violence, cautious hope began to replace fear. Market vendors who had been operating from hidden locations started setting up stalls in town centers. Farmers who had been working their fields only during daylight hours began extending their working time. Children who had grown accustomed to playing silently began to laugh and shout with the abandon of normal childhood. The joint community patrols were initially awkward affairs. Military soldiers and former insurgents walked the same routes together, their weapons slung but ready, their conversations limited to operational necessities. Trust was non-existent, but professional respect gradually developed as both sides demonstrated their commitment to the ceasefire. Traore arrived in Djibo, the provincial capital, on the 8th day of the experiment. He came without the usual presidential entourage, no armored vehicles, no media teams, no ceremonial protocols. Instead, he traveled in a small convoy of civilian vehicles, accompanied only by essential staff and security personnel. His first stop was the regional hospital, which had been operating with minimal staff and supplies due to the security situation. The hospital was overcrowded with patients who had been unable to seek medical care during the height of the conflict, and the medical staff was struggling with shortages of everything from basic medicines to surgical equipment. Dr. Aminata Sawadogo, the hospital's chief medical officer, greeted the president with a mixture of professional courtesy and barely concealed frustration. "Mr. President," she said as they toured the overcrowded wards, "we appreciate your visit, but what we really need is consistent support. We've had promises before. Politicians who come for photo opportunities and then disappear while we continue to work without adequate resources." Traore appreciated her directness. It was exactly the kind of honest feedback he needed to understand the real situation on the ground. "Doctor," he replied, "I'm not here for photographs. I'm here to understand what it will take to make this peace sustainable. Tell me what you need, and I'll tell you what we can provide." They spent 2 hours walking through the hospital, talking with patients and staff, documenting needs and discussing solutions. The president took notes personally, asking detailed questions about supply chains, personnel requirements, and infrastructure needs. One patient, an elderly man recovering from surgery to remove shrapnel from an old wound, grabbed Traore's hand as he passed. "Are you really the president?" the man asked in more. "I am," Traore replied in the same language. "Then tell me, is this peace real? Can my grandchildren finally go to school without fear?" It was a question that cut to the heart of everything Traore was trying to accomplish. "I don't know," he answered honestly, "but I'm going to do everything in my power to make it real."
His next stop was more symbolic but equally important. The ruins of Djibo's main secondary school stood at the center of town, its walls blackened by fire and its classrooms filled with rubble. The building had been attacked 3 years earlier during a particularly intense period of the conflict, and its destruction had come to symbolize the war's impact on education and opportunity for young people. Standing in what had once been the school's main courtyard, Traore was joined by Amadou Dicko, a local teacher who had refused to leave the region despite the dangers. "We've been holding classes under that tree," Dicko explained, pointing to a large baobab that provided the only significant shade in the area. "Sometimes we have 30 students, sometimes only 5, depending on the security situation, but we never stopped trying to teach." The teacher's dedication was both inspiring and heartbreaking. He and a handful of colleagues had maintained some semblance of education for local children throughout the worst periods of the conflict, often at significant personal risk. "What would it take to rebuild the school properly?" Traore asked. "Materials, labor, and security," Dicko replied without hesitation. "We can provide the labor. Many local men are skilled builders, but we need cement, roofing materials, windows, desks, books, and we need assurance that if we rebuild, it won't just be destroyed again." Traore made another note in his folder. The reconstruction of Djibo's school would become a test of whether the ceasefire could create space for genuine development rather than just temporary calm. Not everything about the Soum experiment proceeded smoothly. On the 15th day of the ceasefire, a convoy carrying medical supplies was attacked by unknown gunmen about 30 kilometers from Djibo. 5 aid workers were killed, and several tons of desperately needed medicines were stolen. The attack threatened to derail the entire peace process. Government hardliners immediately blamed El Gazawi's forces and demanded military retaliation. Media reports suggested that the insurgent leader had used the ceasefire as cover to regroup and rearm his fighters. But El Gazawi's response was swift and decisive. Within 6 hours of the attack, his forces had captured 3 of the perpetrators and recovered most of the stolen supplies. The captured men were handed over to traditional village elders for judgment according to customary law, a gesture that respected local authority while demonstrating the insurgent leader's commitment to maintaining order in territories under his influence. The investigation revealed that the attack had been carried out by a splinter group that rejected El Gazawi's authority and opposed any accommodation with the government. This discovery highlighted one of the fundamental challenges of negotiating with insurgent organizations: the difficulty of ensuring that field commanders and local cells would comply with agreements made by senior leadership. El Gazawi used the incident to consolidate his control over the insurgency, purging commanders who opposed the peace process and promoting those who supported it. It was a risky internal political maneuver that could have fragmented his organization, but it demonstrated his personal commitment to making the ceasefire work. A similar challenge emerged on the government side, when Colonel Bamba, the regional military commander for Soum province, violated the joint patrol agreement by launching a nighttime raid on a suspected insurgent compound. The operation resulted in the deaths of 2 civilians and the destruction of several homes in a village that had been cooperating with the peace process. Traore's response was equally decisive. Colonel Bamba was relieved of command within 24 hours and reassigned to a desk job in the capital. The message to other military commanders was clear: the ceasefire would be enforced from the top down, regardless of personal opinions about its wisdom or effectiveness. These incidents, while disruptive, actually strengthened the peace process by demonstrating that both Traore and El Gazawi were willing to discipline their own subordinates to maintain the agreement. It showed that their commitment to peace was stronger than their loyalty to hardliners within their respective organizations.
The Somme ceasefire attracted intense international attention, most of it negative. French officials expressed concern that Burkina Faso was legitimizing terrorism and undermining regional counterterrorism efforts. American military advisors questioned whether Traore's government could be relied upon as a security partner. European Union diplomats worried about the precedent being set for other African conflicts. The pressure reached a crescendo when Traore announced that he would invite El Gazawi to Wagadugu for formal peace negotiations. International headlines declared that a terrorist leader was being legitimized and welcomed into the highest levels of government. France condemns in the strongest terms any negotiation with terrorist organizations, read an official statement from the Foreign Ministry in Paris. Such actions undermine the fight against extremism and endanger the security of the entire Sahel region. Similar statements came from Washington, Brussels, and other Western capitals. Several international aid organizations suspended operations in Burkina Faso, citing concerns about the government's new policy direction. Some military cooperation agreements were quietly put on hold pending clarification of Traore's intentions. The pressure was intense and personal. Traore received angry phone calls from foreign leaders who had previously been supportive allies. Diplomatic invitations were withdrawn, and scheduled state visits were postponed indefinitely. But there was also support from unexpected quarters. Several African leaders privately expressed admiration for Traore's courage and his commitment to finding African solutions to African problems. Civil society organizations that had been calling for dialogue rather than military action praised his willingness to take personal risks for peace. Most importantly, public opinion within Burkina Faso was cautiously supportive. Polling data showed that while many citizens were nervous about negotiating with insurgents, they were also tired of war and willing to support any genuine effort to end the conflict.
"We have tried foreign solutions for 13 years, Traore said in a televised address to the nation. We have accepted foreign military bases, foreign advisors, foreign strategies. The result has been more death, more destruction, more suffering for our people. Now we will try something different. We will try to solve our problems ourselves as Burkinabe people, using our own wisdom and our own courage." The speech resonated with a population that had grown weary of being told that their problems could only be solved by outside intervention. For the first time in years, there was a sense that their government was truly representing their interests rather than the priorities of foreign capitals. The invitation to formal peace talks in the capital city represented a dramatic escalation of the peace process. El Gazawi's arrival in Ouagadougou was unprecedented. Never before had an active insurgent leader been received by a West African government for official negotiations. Security preparations were extraordinary. The entire route from the airport to the presidential palace was cleared and secured. Counter-sniper teams were positioned on rooftops. Electronic surveillance systems monitored all communications in the area. Yet, despite these precautions, the atmosphere was more diplomatic than militaristic. El Gazawi arrived wearing traditional white robes rather than military fatigues, accompanied by a small delegation of advisors and community representatives. His demeanor was serious but not hostile, the bearing of someone who understood the historic significance of the moment. The talks took place in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Presidential Palace, a spacious room with high ceilings and traditional African artwork that provided a dignified setting for the negotiations. On one side of a large conference table sat government officials, military commanders, and representatives of civil society organizations. On the other side sat El Gazawi's delegation, including former fighters, northern community leaders, and traditional authorities. The first day was tense and confrontational. Accusations flew back and forth as both sides aired grievances accumulated over 13 years of conflict. Victims' families confronted those they held responsible for their losses. Former combatants justified their actions and condemned their opponents' tactics. One particularly emotional moment came when Fatimata Wederaga, a teacher from Dori, whose school had been burned in an insurgent attack, stood to address El Gazawi directly. "You destroyed my school," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You forced me to flee my home, abandon my students, give up my life's work. How can you justify taking education away from children who had done nothing to hurt you?" El Gazawi listened respectfully, then rose to respond. "Madam, I cannot undo what was done to your school or to you personally. But I can tell you that the decision to target that school was based on intelligence indicating it was being used as a military outpost. We later learned that intelligence was false, provided by someone with personal grievances against your community. It was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement of error and an explanation that went beyond the usual justifications for collateral damage." The breakthrough came on the third day, when Aissata Compaore, a young woman from Djibo, stood to address both sides of the conference table. She wore a blue headscarf and traditional dress, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and unwavering. "I lost my entire family in this war," she said. "My father, my mother, my 2 brothers. One explosion, one moment, and everyone I loved was gone forever. The people who killed them are probably in this room, either among the government forces who were conducting the operation or among the insurgents who planted the device." The room fell completely silent as she continued. "I will never forgive what happened to my family. I will never forget their faces or stop missing them. But I want this war to end. I want no other young woman to experience what I have experienced. I want no other family to be destroyed by hatred and violence." Her words carried a moral authority that transcended political arguments and military strategies. Here was someone who had paid the ultimate price of the conflict, speaking not for revenge, but for reconciliation. "If I can choose healing over hatred," she concluded, "then surely leaders and commanders can choose peace over war." The impact of her testimony was immediate and profound. The tone of the negotiations shifted from accusation to collaboration, from finger-pointing to problem-solving. Both sides began to focus on practical measures that could address grievances and build sustainable peace. After 6 days of intensive negotiations, the historic Wagadugu Accord was signed in a ceremony that brought together representatives from across Burkina Faso's political and social spectrum. The agreement contained 4 major provisions that would reshape the country's political landscape. First, the complete withdrawal of French military forces from Burkina Faso within 90 days. This included the closure of military bases, the recall of military advisors, the termination of intelligence cooperation, and the end of French-led counter-terrorism operations. The decision represented a fundamental shift in Burkina Faso's security posture, from dependence on foreign military support to reliance on indigenous solutions. Second, the establishment of regional autonomy for northern provinces, including Soum, Udalin, Seno, and Yaga. This autonomy included control over local governance structures,
education systems that respected indigenous languages and cultures, and resource management that prioritized community needs over central government revenues. Traditional authorities would be empowered to resolve disputes according to customary law, and development projects would be designed and implemented by local communities rather than imposed by outside agencies. Fourth, the creation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission chaired jointly by victims of the conflict and traditional community leaders. This body would have the authority to investigate human rights violations by all parties, provide platforms for testimony and healing, and recommend reparations for those who had suffered losses. Unlike similar commissions in other countries, it would be funded and operated entirely by Burkinabe institutions rather than international organizations. The signing ceremony was deliberately modest, reflecting the Accord's emphasis on local solutions rather than international recognition. No foreign dignitaries were present, no international media covered the event, no global peacekeeping organizations endorsed the agreement. This was a Burkinabe solution to a Burkinabe problem, implemented by Burkinabe people according to their own values and priorities. Traore and El Gazawi signed the document side by side, their signatures marking the official end to 13 years of armed conflict. There were no victory celebrations, no declarations of triumph over defeated enemies. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction that something unprecedented had been accomplished through dialogue and compromise rather than force and domination. The village of Tinsa had been transformed. Where once stood the charred remains of homes destroyed by war, new buildings now rose from carefully planned foundations. The sound that echoed across the community was not gunfire or explosions, but the laughter of children playing in courtyards that had been silent for too long. Women drew water from wells that had been repaired through joint community labor, their conversations flowing freely without the constant vigilance that had marked the war years. Walking down the village's main path on a bright morning in March, two figures moved slowly side by side, stopping frequently to greet residents and observe the reconstruction work. President Ibrahim Traore and Muhammad El Gazawi, once sworn enemies, now walked together as partners in an unprecedented experiment in conflict resolution. The contrast with their first meeting in the desert tent could not have been more striking. Then they had been surrounded by armed guards and mutual suspicion, speaking carefully across a divide that seemed impossible to bridge. Now they moved freely among people who had learned to see them not as representatives of opposing factions, but as leaders who had chosen peace over continued warfare. An elderly woman approached them as they paused near the newly reconstructed school. Her face, lined with the accumulated wisdom and suffering of 70 decades, held both of their gazes as she spoke. "We buried too many of our children in the years of fighting. We fed our sons to this war like grain to hungry cattle, always hoping that the next sacrifice would be the last. But now we see what could have been possible all along, people working together instead of destroying each other." She paused, studying both men with eyes that had witnessed the full cycle of conflict and reconciliation. The road ahead remains long and difficult. There will be those who try to restart the fighting, those who profit from chaos and division. Will you walk this path of peace together, even when it becomes harder than war? Neither man answered immediately. They had learned that the most important questions demanded thoughtful responses rather than quick promises. Instead, they continued their tour of Tinsa, observing the tangible evidence of what cooperation could accomplish. The school that had been reduced to rubble during the conflict now stood rebuilt with local materials and labor. Its classrooms buzzed with the voices of children learning in both French and more, following a curriculum that respected traditional knowledge while preparing students for modern opportunities. Former insurgent fighters worked alongside government employees to maintain the building and its grounds, their previous antagonism replaced by shared pride in what they had created together. Near the edge of the village, farmers were working together to repair irrigation channels that had been destroyed during military operations. The project brought together communities that had been separated by battle lines for years, requiring careful negotiation and compromise to resolve competing claims over water rights and land use. Yet the work proceeded steadily, driven by the simple recognition that everyone benefited when crops grew successfully. The health clinic, once a target for attack because it was seen as a symbol of government presence, now operated as a truly community-based institution. Its staff included former fighters who had received medical training through the reintegration program, working alongside doctors and nurses who had remained throughout the conflict. The building itself bore no government insignia or partisan symbols, only a simple sign in local languages identifying it as a place of healing for all who needed care. Yet the peace, while real and growing stronger, was not without its challenges and complexities. Border regions still experienced occasional violence from criminal groups and splinter factions that rejected the reconciliation process. Some international partners continued to view the accord with suspicion, reducing aid and cooperation in response to what they saw as unacceptable compromises with terrorism. Economic development remained slow and uneven, requiring patient investment and careful planning to create sustainable opportunities for a population traumatized by years of conflict. Most significantly, the psychological wounds of war would take generations to fully heal. Children who had grown up amid violence sometimes struggled to adjust to peaceful routines. Adults who had survived by maintaining constant vigilance found it difficult to trust that safety would last. Former combatants on both sides carried guilt and trauma that could not be resolved simply through political agreements and economic programs. In Jibo, the provincial capital, these complexities were particularly visible. The town served as a testing ground for many of the Accord's most ambitious provisions, from joint security patrols to integrated education systems to collaborative economic development projects. Progress was measurable but uneven, marked by small victories and occasional setbacks that reminded everyone how fragile peace could be. The rebuilt secondary school had become a symbol of both hope and persistent challenges. Classes were held in Arabic, French, and more, reflecting the cultural diversity of the region and the Accord's commitment to respecting indigenous languages. But some parents remained reluctant to send their children to school, fearing that education would somehow compromise their traditional values or expose their families to outside influences they could not control. The joint security patrols, initially awkward affairs where former enemies walked together in uncomfortable silence, had evolved into generally effective partnerships. Government soldiers and former insurgents had learned to work together professionally, sharing intelligence and coordinating responses to criminal activity and cross-border threats. Yet tensions occasionally flared when different groups interpreted security situations according to their own experiences and priorities. Economic development faced the most persistent obstacles. Years of conflict had destroyed much of the region's infrastructure and displaced many of its most skilled workers. International investors remained wary of the area's stability, while traditional economic activities like farming and livestock raising required time to recover from the disruptions of war. The reintegration program provided some opportunities for former fighters, but creating enough jobs for all those who needed them remained an ongoing challenge. The success of the Wagadugu Accord began to influence thinking about conflict resolution across West Africa and beyond. Delegations from Mali, Niger, Chad, and other countries facing similar insurgencies arrived in Burkina Faso to study how direct dialogue between governments and armed groups could produce sustainable peace agreements. Academic institutions and policy think tanks published analyses of the Burkina model, examining how local cultural values and traditional conflict resolution mechanisms had been integrated with modern diplomatic processes. The emphasis on indigenous solutions rather than international mediation attracted particular attention from scholars and practitioners who had grown skeptical of externally imposed peace processes. However, the international reception remained mixed. Western governments that had invested heavily in military solutions to Sahel conflicts viewed the accord with suspicion and concern. Some officials argued that negotiating with insurgent groups encouraged other armed movements and undermined the principle that terrorism should never be rewarded with political concessions. The French government was particularly critical, viewing Burkina Faso's decision to end military cooperation as a betrayal of long-standing alliances and a dangerous precedent for former colonies. Some French officials privately worried that successful indigenous peace processes would reduce demand for French military intervention and diplomatic mediation throughout Francophone Africa. American policymakers were divided in their assessments. Military and intelligence officials generally opposed any accommodation with groups they classified as terrorist organizations, arguing that such agreements sent the wrong message to similar movements worldwide. However, some diplomatic and development professionals recognized that the accord had achieved more progress in 1 year than military operations had accomplished in over a decade. Regional African organizations were more supportive, with the ECOWAS formally endorsing the accord as an example of African solutions to African problems. The African Union's Peace and Security Council passed a resolution encouraging member states to explore similar approaches to internal conflicts, while emphasizing the importance of maintaining human rights standards and democratic governance throughout any negotiation process. Most importantly, public opinion within Burkina Faso remained cautiously optimistic about the peace process. Polling data showed that while citizens remained concerned about security and economic challenges, they strongly supported continued dialogue and cooperation between former adversaries. The sight of government officials and former insurgent leaders working together had become normalized rather than shocking, suggesting that the psychological foundations for sustainable peace were taking root. On the first anniversary of the Wagadugu Accord, President Traore found himself alone in his study, reflecting on a year that had transformed both his country and his understanding of leadership. The simple room remained unchanged. The same cream-colored walls, the same maps and photographs, the same modest furniture that reflected his rejection of presidential luxury. But the man who occupied it had been profoundly changed by the experiences of the past 12 months. In a leather-bound journal that he had kept throughout his presidency, Traore wrote, "Peace, I have learned, is not a destination, but a practice. It is not something that is signed in ceremonies or declared in speeches, but something that must be chosen again and again, one decision at a time, one conversation at a time, one village at a time. A year ago, everyone called me a fool for walking into that desert to meet El Gazawi. Foreign diplomats questioned my judgment. Military advisors warned of catastrophic consequences. Political opponents accused me of betraying our nation's sovereignty and dignity. Even some of my closest supporters worried that I was risking everything for a peace that might prove impossible to achieve. But today, in the village of Tinsa, I watched a mother hug her son goodbye as he walked to school without fear. That moment, ordinary, unremarkable, taken for granted in peaceful societies, represented everything we have been fighting to accomplish. The reward for taking seemingly impossible risks is not glory or recognition, but the simple restoration of normal life for people who had almost forgotten what normal felt like. The road we have traveled has taught me uncomfortable truths about governments, about conflict, about human nature itself. I have learned how easily people can be weaponized when they are abandoned by the institutions that should protect them. I have seen how quickly victims can become perpetrators when they lose hope for justice through peaceful means. I have witnessed how hate can be learned and how it can also be unlearned, given time and patient effort. Most importantly, I have discovered that the most radical thing a leader can do is sometimes the simplest. Treat your enemies as human beings capable of reason and growth, rather than monsters who can only be destroyed. This does not mean ignoring their crimes or excusing their violence, but recognizing that sustainable peace requires understanding why people choose war and addressing those underlying causes. The work ahead remains immense. Reconciliation is harder than victory because it requires everyone to give up something they value: pride, revenge, the comfortable certainty of moral superiority. Economic development is slower than military conquest because it requires building rather than destroying. Trust is more fragile than fear because it must be earned every day rather than imposed by force. Yet I remain optimistic about our future because I have seen what becomes possible when people choose to see each other as fellow humans rather than mortal enemies. The children playing in Tenza's courtyards, the farmers working together on irrigation projects, the former fighters teaching school alongside former government officials, these are the true architects of our nation's future. History will judge whether our experiment in indigenous peacemaking can survive the pressures and challenges that lie ahead. Other leaders in other conflicts will decide whether our example offers lessons worth following or warnings worth heeding. International partners will determine whether they can support peace processes that do not conform to their preferred models and strategies. But none of that changes the fundamental truth we have discovered, that Burkina Faso people, when given the opportunity and the leadership, can solve Burkina Faso problems using Burkina Faso wisdom and Burkina Faso courage. We have proven that African conflicts do not require external military intervention to reach sustainable resolution. We have demonstrated that dialogue is more powerful than drones, that negotiation is more effective than airstrikes, that reconciliation creates more lasting security than conquest. The desert handshake that began this journey was witnessed only by sand and sky, but its consequences have rippled across our nation and beyond, challenging assumptions about how peace can be built and maintained in a world too often convinced that some conflicts are too deep, too complex, too bitter to be resolved through human conversation and compromise. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new tests of our commitment to peace over war, new opportunities to choose understanding over hatred. The guns have fallen silent in many places, but the harder work of building trust and creating opportunity has only just begun. We are no longer fighting for victory over our enemies. We are fighting for something much more difficult to achieve and more precious to preserve, a future in which our children inherit hope rather than hatred, possibility rather than perpetual conflict. The Phantom of the Sahel has become a partner in peace. The president who was supposed to defeat him has become his collaborator in healing a broken nation. And in villages across northern Burkina Faso, people are learning to live without the constant sound of gunfire for the first time in a generation. This is how peace is built,
not through grand gestures or international conferences, but through countless small acts of courage by ordinary people who choose to trust each other despite every reason they have been given to remain enemies. The desert taught us that even the most barren landscape can support life when people are willing to dig deep enough to find water. Our nation is learning the same lesson about the possibility of peace in even the most devastated regions of human conflict. The work continues, the peace endures, and in the silence where once there was only the sound of war, we are finally beginning to hear the voices of our children singing. 2 years after the desert handshake that changed everything, the sounds of northern Burkina Faso told a different story than the one that had echoed across the Sahel for so long. Instead of the crack of gunfire and the roar of military vehicles, the dominant sounds were those of construction and conversation, of children at play and farmers at work, of life returning to regions that had been haunted by death for too long. In Wagadugu, President Ibrahim Traore continued to lead a nation that had surprised the world and itself by choosing peace over continued warfare. His approval ratings remained high, not because he had defeated his enemies, but because he had transformed them into partners. The international community gradually adjusted to the reality that Burkina Faso had successfully resolved an intractable conflict through methods that violated most conventional wisdom about counterterrorism and conflict resolution. Muhammad El Gazawi had transitioned from insurgent commander to community leader, working within the legal framework of regional autonomy to address the grievances that had originally driven him to armed resistance. His transformation from phantom of the desert to advocate for peaceful development had not been without controversy or challenge, but it represented a remarkable example of how individuals could evolve beyond the roles that circumstances had imposed upon them. The villages of Soum province continued their steady recovery, supported by development programs that emerged from community priorities rather than external mandates. Schools operated with increasing confidence that they would not become targets. Clinics expanded their services as security improved and resources became available. Markets grew busier as trade routes reopened and economic confidence returned. But the most significant changes were perhaps the most subtle ones, the gradual erosion of fear that had shaped every aspect of daily life during the conflict years. Children no longer flinched at unexpected sounds. Women no longer automatically calculated escape routes when they left their homes. Men no longer viewed every stranger as a potential threat. The peace was not perfect. Criminal violence occasionally disrupted communities along international borders. Political disagreements sometimes flared into heated arguments that reminded everyone how fragile social cohesion could be. Economic development remained slow and uneven, requiring constant attention and investment to create sustainable opportunities for all who needed them. But the fundamental transformation had taken hold. A nation that had been consumed by internal warfare had learned to resolve its differences through dialogue and compromise rather than violence and domination. The desert that had witnessed the first tentative handshake between sworn enemies had become symbolic of the possibility that even the most barren conflicts could bloom into something life-giving when tended with patience and wisdom. And in the silence where once there had been only the sound of war, we were finally beginning to hear the voices of our children singing, a chorus of hope that echoed across the Sahel and reminded the world that peace, however improbable it might seem, remained always within the reach of those brave enough to grasp it.
This story, while fictional, is inspired by the real challenges of conflict resolution in West Africa and the courage of leaders who choose dialogue over warfare, understanding over hatred, and hope over despair. In a world too often convinced that some conflicts are too deep to resolve peacefully, it stands as a reminder that the most radical act is sometimes the simplest, treating your enemies as human beings capable of growth and choosing trust over fear, one conversation at a time.